On to more controllers. The Super Nintendo controller is one of the most standard controllers you can find in all of video gaming. I'll show you why. This is the Super Nintendo controller, one of the colorful ones. I found it on Amazon, or the picture anyway. I was going to take a picture of my own, but it's actually a third-party type one, so I wanted to be a little more pure for this. But you'll see it. It's basically the Nintendo controller with 4 extra buttons. The shoulder buttons, the L and the R button, and the X and the Y button. Fairly simple, but there's something about it that has lasted, and I'm going to show you why. Well, first off, you have to understand the influencers. The Nintendo controller, definitely an influencer. You can see kind of those little, the D-pad right there, and the same place as the start and the select button. Then you look at the Genesis and you're like, well, that's not the same, but the Genesis was based on arcade games and kind of influenced the way the arcade games were. Also, the Genesis came out as kind of a major competitor for the Super Nintendo. Now, whether or not it was an actual competitor is another subject, but there was a lot of talk about how it was a competitor and Nintendo decided to go against it. So they based kind of the curves and the feel on the Sega Genesis controller. Finally, they chose 6 buttons for, playing so that it would fit the same as Street Fighter II and other games like that. Originally, they only used A and B, and you know what? Everything followed that way. All the games like that followed that way. But with Street Fighter II and other consoles or other arcade games, you needed a lot more buttons, so they set it up for that. The L and the R buttons were the strong punch and the strong kick, by the way. So it's actually kind of weird because they switched it around for the Dreamcast. But that's another story. So the games, as you can see, weren't just for the Super Nintendo. I can't remember when the transition happened, and it would take a lot of research to do. But eventually it came to the point where the B button, the bottom button, became jump. And then you had these 2 attack buttons, the 2 side buttons, attack left, attack right. And then you had kind of a special attack. And the L and the R buttons did do things, but they were kind of these adaptive buttons. And I didn't really know how to properly say that. Doesn't mean anything to you until you look at all of the games that have used that exact same scenario. Tony Hawk Pro Skater used the bottom button as the jump. It used 2 different kinds of kick flips, attacks, and then a very special attack for edges, for grinding. The same works for Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It helps that the PlayStation controller was very much so based on the Super Nintendo controller. But you can see these same ideas throughout gaming, Super Nintendo and into the PlayStation era. All the consoles played like this. In fact, if I were to show you a picture of the 3D controller for the Sega Saturn, it would have the same button layout as this, only slightly adapted. So this has been pretty much the standardized system. The shoulder buttons, how the buttons are placed, the D-pad and how it kind of feels, all of that is there. So it's this major thing. It goes on to influence pretty much every console out there. Past this point, you kind of have everything standardized. You see that start button, you see that select button, you have the shoulder buttons. PlayStation added 2 more, and you know what? They followed after that, but it isn't as big of an adaptation to really talk about. This is a PS3 and a Xbox 360 controller, and that's pretty much every game you can imagine is using this setup. There's only one more setup past this point that we're going to talk about, and that is the Halo controls, and that's coming up next.